Good afternoon. I'm Robert George, Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence here at Princeton University. It's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's lecture, which is part of our Herbert W. Vaughan lecture series on America's founding principles. The James Madison Program is dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you'd like to learn more about the Madison Program and our events and activities, please visit our website, which is at JMP, for James Madison Program, jmp.princeton.edu. And you can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter and subscribe to our Madison's Notes podcast. And of course, you can learn more there about all of our upcoming events, both virtual, still have a few virtual events, and in person. Well, it's my very, very, very great pleasure today to introduce our guest lecturer, my dear, dear, dear old friend, David Dalin. Rabbi Dr. Dalin is an historian and currently a senior research fellow at Brandeis University. I'm proud to say he's a former fellow of the James Madison Program here at Princeton. He's the author or co-author of a dozen books, including Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, my favorite and a wonderful, wonderful book, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He's also author of Jews and American Public Life, subtitled Essays on American Jewish History, Politics, and Religion, and the author of State in the American Jewish Experience, which he co-authored with the distinguished scholar Jonathan B. Sarna. In addition to his fellowships at Brandeis and here at Princeton, he was a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today's lecture is entitled Jews, Judaism, and the American Founding. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. David Dalin.
Thank you, Robbie. It's wonderful to be back here. Among scholars of Jewish history, much has been written about the Jewish contribution to the American Revolution and about the impact of the American Revolution on American Jews. The American Revolution definitely ushered in a new era in the changes in law and in the relationship of religion to state that transformed American Jewish life forever after. The foundations of this great change was already being laid at the dawn of the New Republic. Already, during the first decade and a half of American independence, the parameters of religious liberty in the new nation steadily widened in ways that promised the religious equality long hoped for by the Jews of the world. At that time, almost all of them around the world lived under conditions of religious and political persecution, discriminatory legislation, and the burden of special taxation. However, as we shall show, even at the dawn of the American Republic, when very few Jews lived in the colonies of the United States, the foundation was being laid for what would become the freest and the most prosperous community of Jews in the world. The new American equality was evident in the new constitutions promulgated almost in every state after 1776. In these, Jewish citizens were promised a greater measure of religious freedom than they had ever enjoyed before. One example of this new legal freedom was the Northwest Ordinance, adopted in 1785. This encompassed the new lands that would eventually become 6 Midwestern states. The ordinance guaranteed freedom of worship and religious belief in all areas north of the Ohio River. Religious liberty was also evident in Virginia's historic Statute of Religious Freedom. This had originally been drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1779. It came to be considered the classic expression of religious toleration, and American Jews, like so many other people, celebrated it. Finally, with the drafting of the federal constitution by the founders in Philadelphia in 1787, came the First Amendment, which forbade Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There was also an Article 6 forbidding any religious test for public office. With those words, at least theoretically, the hopes of Revolutionary era America Jews for equal rights were finally realized. It must be said that these new legal protections did not actually affect the many Jews by number. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, only approximately 2,000 Jews lived in the British colonies. They were concentrated in 5 cities: New York, Philadelphia, Newport, Charleston, and Savannah. These few Jews, it has been written, played no significant role in bringing about these epochal developments. There were no Jewish delegates to the Continental Congresses, no Jewish signatories to the Declaration of Independence, and no Jewish delegates to the Constitutional Convention meeting in Philadelphia in 1787. As historians have pointed out, the Constitutional Convention and most of the discussions concerning the place of religion in American life completely ignored Jews. The founders were far more directly concerned with avoiding conflicts between Protestants and Catholics or with dissenting Protestant churches. As it happened, full equality everywhere did not come right away. The promises of the U.S. Constitution were not immediately translated into practice and were fully effective only on the federal level. At the time of the federal Constitution's ratification, all but 2 states had a religious test banning Jews from public office. In the states, the ban was upheld either by statute or by requiring the applicant for office to place his hand on a Christian Bible and swear using the words "upon the true faith of a Christian." South Carolina's state constitution, in fact, made the Christian Protestant religion the established religion of the state. In some states, only Trinitarian Protestants could vote or testify in legal trials. As late as 1816, more than the original 13 states could still deny Jews full political equality, more than half. Nevertheless, even then, Jews enjoyed more liberty in the United States than in any other part of the world. There was no limitation on their occupation or getting married or where they could live, for example, or any special taxes just for Jews. Factors which had embittered their lives in Europe. There was a second factor pointing to a strong Jewish connection in the 15 or so years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Aside from the legal frameworks established during the infant years of the United States, there is no doubt that the Jewish heritage played an enormous role in the thinking and creativity of the founders. First, what is evident in the record is the importance to the founders of the Hebrew language and Hebrew biblical imagery. Beyond the New Testament, our founders were raised and educated on the New Testament or Hebrew Bible from earliest childhood, and they knew it backwards and forwards. Indeed, it has been noted that in many American homes, the Bible was one of the few books in the house. For the founders, words, phrases, whole passages from it committed to memory flowed through their pens and permeated their thoughts and worldview. It is here first in the Hebrew biblical heritage that they made their biggest contribution to the American founding. James Madison himself was one of the most accomplished Hebrew scholars among the founders. He studied the language as an undergraduate here at Princeton and gave a valedictory address in Hebrew when he graduated in 1771. He also stayed an extra year to pursue graduate study in Hebrew with Princeton President John Witherspoon. He was interested in the study and the structure of Hebrew biblical poetry and its common literary device of parallelism, which he believed could be used to explain complex ideas with charity. Like their Puritan forebears, the founding fathers who led America's War of Independence compared their own struggle with Great Britain to that of the ancient Israelites' struggles with Egypt. This is revealed in the correspondence of America's founders. It is also evident in recorded sermons of the Protestant clergy, which they heard every Sunday when they went to church. Old Testament analogies were frequently drawn by preachers in their efforts to justify or to explain the common desire to break away from British rule. Throughout the War of Independence, Protestant ministers urged their patriotic congregants to resist the British just as the biblical Hebrews, led by Moses, had resisted the Egyptians. For the American colonists fighting for their independence from England, King George was viewed as the Pharaoh of the Old Testament, and the Atlantic Ocean is the Red Sea. George Washington himself was compared to the biblical Moses, who was called by God to bring freedom to his nation. This fascination with biblical imagery was apparent when independence was declared in 1776. At that time, the Continental Congress requested John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson to design an official seal appropriate for the new nation. Franklin and Jefferson each proposed designs depicting the ancient Israelites crossing the Red Sea, with Pharaoh in hot pursuit and Moses standing on the other side. The seal had on one side the name of the new republic, the United States of America, 1776, and on the reverse, surrounding the picture of Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea, the phrase rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. The Hebrew language itself was also held in high esteem by the founders. This was so much so that a story emerged at the time of the Revolution that Hebrew was being considered as a possible substitute for English as the American language. Now, while this did not, of course, happen, soldiers have noted that, scholars rather have noted that the founders of Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Princeton, and the other early colleges were men for whom the Hebrew language was a source of inspiration and an essential component of a good education. This was especially the case at Harvard, where the first two college presidents were renowned scholars of Hebrew and were all freshmen, had to study the language until 1787. In that year, they were permitted to substitute French in fulfilling their academic requirement. John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams, for example, who both pursued their undergraduate studies at Harvard in the 1750s, studied Hebrew there with Judah Manas, who taught Hebrew language and grammar for almost 50 years, from 1722 to 1761. He was also the author of the Grammar of the Hebrew Tongue, the first Hebrew textbook to be published in the American colonies. The rule at Harvard then was that all professors had to be professing Christians. So in honor to teach at Harvard, Monas had to convert to Christianity. As the example of Monas's necessary conversion shows, while many of the founders had studied Hebrew and admired the Jewish religion of the ancient Hebrews, there was some ambivalence toward living Jews and Judaism. This is evident in the political culture and thought. Some founders crafted test oaths restricting the participation of Jews in politics and public life, or had negative things to say in reference to the actual Jews alive at their time. There was another side of this, however. On the other hand, other founders appointed or recommended the appointment of Jews to civic and political office. They forged cordial relationships with Jewish synagogues and personal friendships with individual Jewish supporters of the American Revolution and the patriotic cause. Some never socialized with their Jewish contemporaries or counted Jews among their neighbors or friends. Still, Jews were amongst the groups of minority faiths to assert their claim to religious liberty, and that itself was a cause which most of the founders supported and espoused. I will now discuss how these facts apply specifically to three of the founders, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. I will discuss how Jews and the Jewish religious tradition of the Hebrew Bible influenced their thoughts and shaped the enduring Jewish contribution to the American founding and the early republic. First of all, George Washington. President George Washington was the first leader of a modern nation to acknowledge the Jewish people openly as full-fledged citizens of the country in which they had chosen to settle. Although, as we have seen, the Jewish community was small at the time of George Washington's inauguration, Washington became personally aware of and grateful for the substantive contribution that Jews had made to the cause of independence and to the founding of the new nation. We are told that between 100 and 160 Jewish men actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and it was a very small army, so their presence was aptly noted. Washington, a lifelong member of the Church of the Anglican Church in Virginia, had almost no contact with members of the Jewish community prior to 1776. This changed dramatically during the Revolutionary War, when General Washington assumed command of the Continental Army. There, for the first time, he met real live Jews. He was struck by the loyalty, courage, and devotion to the patriotic cause of the Jews who fought side by side with him. He also met those who offered a great sacrifice to themselves and supported the revolutionary cause. It made a profound impression on him. Of the several Jews who actually fought side by side with Washington on the field of battle, one was Benjamin Nonis, a French Jew who had emigrated to America in 1772. Nonis served as a major on General Washington's staff and distinguished himself for bravery during the bitter siege of Savannah. Two Jewish members of Washington's regiment, Isaac Franks and Washington's fellow Virginian, Philip Moses Russell, shared the hardships of the bitter winter at Valley Forge, who achieved the rank of colonel before his retirement from the military, and we are told made a worthy name for himself as a brave and dedicated soldier in the Continental Army, and consequently enjoyed the personal friendship of George Washington. Russell, a commissioned officer who served as a surgeon's mate on Washington's medical staff, was the most conspicuous Jewish medical officer at Valley Forge. His personal relationship with George Washington is attested to by a special letter of recommendation that he received from General Washington, honoring Russell for his assiduous and faithful attention to the sick and wounded, as well as his cool and collected deportment in battle. Historians have noted that after the war was over, General Washington did not forget the loyalty and dedication of the Jewish soldiers of the Continental Army, who had faithfully marched with him from beginning to the end of the war. In particular, his friendship with Colonel Isaac Franks, who went on to become a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, continued throughout the years of his presidency. For example, for 2 months in 1793, when a deadly yellow fever epidemic spread throughout Philadelphia, which was then, of course, the nation's capital, President Washington sought refuge in his friend Franks' spacious home in the Philadelphia suburbs, away from the worst of the contagion. During the war, Washington was especially indebted to the devotion of Polish-born Jewish Chaim Salomon, Salomon is perhaps the best known amongst his people for his contributions to the American Revolution. Without him, nothing of the revolution, from supplies to ammunitions to soldiers' salaries, would have ever been paid for. Congress and the state assemblies did not allocate enough money for these necessities, and the printed Continental governmental army money was essentially worthless. Throughout the long years and months of the war with Britain, Washington continually depended on Salomon's financial prowess and his ability to access hard French and other European currencies to keep the revolution going. He also made personal loans to many of the founders. Salomon often borrowed or used his own money to satisfy the needs of Washington's army, and we are told that he himself died insolvent. On a happier occasion, Jews were present and marched in the inauguration parade of President George Washington on April 30th, 1789, where afterwards, we are told, a table of kosher food was provided. Among the 14 clergymen participating in the festivities was the American-born Gerson Mendes Seixas, an American-born rabbi, and Seixas, by the way, spelled S-E-I-X-A-S, head of Sheriff Israel, otherwise known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, the first Jewish congregation to be established in North America. It still exists to this day. Rabbi Seixas had recently led his congregation in special services to mark the adoption of the U.S. federal Constitution, a fervent patriot and a very well-known figure among American Jewish historians and American Jews. Seixas had fled New York City with most of his congregation and the synagogue's ritual objects, and gone to Philadelphia when the British came and occupied New York City in the fall of 1776. He preferred going there rather than staying and living under British rule. Besides, as such a publicly pro-revolutionary figure, his own safety was in jeopardy. In his sermons throughout the War of Independence, Seixas had regularly called on God to bless the revolution, the Congress, and of course, George Washington. No other Jewish leader of this era mingled so easily with the Protestant leaders of the American founding as did Rabbi Gerson Mendes Seixas. Washington himself was also, as historians have noted, a religious man with a strong commitment to religious liberty as a whole, something which has been the subject of much scholarly study. As Michael Novak has pointed out, George Washington, like many of the other founders, insisted on speaking openly of God. Washington had no reservations about publicly acknowledging the importance of religious faith for the nation's destiny. As commander of the Continental Army, Washington frequently invoked God's assistance for the American cause, often in words that made a deep impression on his fellow citizens. Indeed, as Michael Novak has aptly noted, Washington gave orders that each day begin with a formal prayer to be led by the officers of each military unit so that the men of the Continental Army might secure God's blessings on their efforts every day. the subject of religious liberty, Washington left behind no official public document on it in the manner of Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. He was, however, no less dedicated to securing religious freedom than his second and third presidential successors. This was best revealed in his correspondence. Indeed, religious liberty was a cardinal principle of Washington's political philosophy. In a 1783 letter, Washington wrote that the establishment of civil and religious liberty was the prime motive that induced me to the field of battle. He addressed the theme of religious liberty most directly in a series of letters written after his assumption of the American presidency. Perhaps the most famous of these letters is the one Washington wrote to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, on August 17, 1790. Rhode Island was the last state which, after some struggle, voted to ratify the federal Constitution. In the summer of 1790, some months after his inauguration, Washington was visiting Newport on a sort of goodwill tour, celebrating the ratification and the cementing of the unity of the former fractious colonies, which were now the United States of America. On this occasion, he received numerous congratulatory letters from the town of Newport and its Christian clergy, including a carefully crafted one from the city's Jewish congregation. The letter from the Jewish community of Newport was filled with Old Testament references, which the writers knew Washington would understand and also appreciate. They began with praise for Washington, a remembrance of the days of the Revolution, and best wishes for the success of his presidency. Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, they wrote. With pleasure, we reflect on those days of difficulty and danger, when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword, shielded your head in the day of battle. And we rejoice to think that the same Spirit who rested in the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to preside over the providences of the Babylonian Empire, rested and will ever rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate of these states. The letter concluded with thanks for the blessings of civil and religious liberty, which we enjoy under an equal and benign administration, and a personal blessing to Washington himself, that the angel who conducted our forefathers throughout the wilderness into the promised land graciously conduct you through all the difficulties and dangers of this mortal life. And when, like Joshua, full of days and full of honor, you are gathered to your fathers, may you be admitted into the heavenly paradise to partake of the water of life and the tree of immortality. President George Washington no doubt faced a mountain of letters to attend to that August day in 1790, when the letter from the Hebrew congregation of Newport was delivered to his hand. However, he neglected them all when he took up his pen to write an immediate reply that same day. That letter, which to this day is prominently displayed and read aloud once each year in a synagogue in Philadelphia, has been called a foundation stone of American religious freedom and the separation of church and state. And some of the words, in fact, are carved on the walls of the Washington Monument. Washington began his reply. While I received with much satisfaction your address and replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I have experienced in my visit to Newport. He went on to recall the dangers of revolutionary time and to discuss the vision of the new nation, and especially, specifically, to refer to the United States government as an experiment that might be, as Lincoln would generations later, refer to it as the last best hope on earth. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the most sweet from a consciousness that succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security, Washington wrote. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and a happy people. The citizens of the United States have a great right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed this in the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. This section is most important because unconditional citizenship was something Jews had never enjoyed anywhere, even in the most enlightened nations of those days. Washington ended his letter with thanks to the Hebrew congregation's good wishes and a quotation from one of his favorite passages from the prophets. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies gather light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. I will now turn to Alexander Hamilton. George Washington's views on religious liberty and political equality were shared by Alexander Hamilton. Like Washington, Hamilton had a personal acquaintance with individual Jews, a highly favorable attitude toward Judaism as a religion, and the Jewish quest for religious liberty in the early republic. Of all the founders, Alexander Hamilton had the closest connection to Jews, a connection that went back to his childhood. Alexander Hamilton was born in 1755 on the island of Nevis in the British West Indies, one of Great Britain's Caribbean possessions, which during the 18th century had a thriving population of Sephardic Jews, many of whom had escaped persecution in Brazil and entered the local sugar trade. By the 1720s, the Jews of Nevis had organized a synagogue, a Jewish school, and a well-kept cemetery that survives to this very day. Hamilton's mother, Rachel, was the daughter of a French physician who had emigrated from France to the West Indies and settled in the island of Nevis, where he owned a small sugar plantation. Raised as a Protestant, Hamilton's mother Rachel's first marriage was to Johann Michael Levine, a Sephardic Jew of Danish descent. Their marriage, never a happy one, lasted for only a few years. And after her separation from Levine, Rachel began living in Nevis with a Scotsman, James Hamilton. Rachel was never truly able to marry James and thus legitimate their love match. She could not divorce her first husband because divorce in the 18th century was almost unheard of. In addition, if done at all, divorce under Crown colony law at the time was, as Hamilton's biographers have noted, a prohibitively expensive and torturous affair. Thus, when Alexander was born of Rachel Levine and James Hamilton's union on January 11, 1755, the boy's birth was viewed as illegitimate by the Anglican Church. Under the rules of the church at the time, this meant that they could not offer Alexander church membership or education in the school of Nevis. The young Hamilton ended up being educated by Jewish teachers in the small Sephardic Jewish school on Nevis. There he was tutored in Hebrew, and as his son would later recall, even taught to repeat the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. Perhaps from this exposure at an impressionable age, Hamilton harbored a lifelong reverence for Jews, a reverence unique amongst the founding fathers. In later years, Hamilton would write admiringly that the Jews were a people whose heritage and history was entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs, and the effect of some great providential plan. Later on, in the heat of a renowned legal case, Hamilton challenged the opposing counsel. Why distrust the evidence of the Jews? Discredit them, and you destroy the Christian religion. Alexander Hamilton fully supported the Jewish quest for religious liberty in the new nation. In 1784, Hamilton was drafting the new charter of his alma mater, King's College, which soon came to be known as Columbia College. He saw to it that the clergymen of all faiths were on its new board of regents, including the local rabbi, the aforementioned Gerson Mendes-Seixas, New York's most eminent Jewish religious leader. Hamilton had come to admire him as one of New York's most courageous patriots during the War of Independence. Seixas thus became the first American Jew to serve on the governing board of an American university, and he held that prestigious position for more than 30 years. Hamilton's respect for Judaism and for Jews is also attested to by the fact that he was one of the only lawyers among the Founding Fathers, and many of the Founding Fathers were indeed lawyers, who had Jewish clients in his law practice. Many of these clients happened to be members of Rabbi Seixas's congregation. When Hamilton was fatally wounded by Aaron Burr in the duel of 1804, the rabbi, as well as many of his friends and clients in the congregation, mourned him. We'll now turn to John Adams. Much has been made of John Adams's admiration for Judaism. His appreciation for Jews and their contribution to civilization, and his interest in Jewish books and the Hebrew Bible. In accordance with his Puritan heritage, Adams possessed a personal library containing several books that dealt with biblical and modern Jewish issues that he read often and remembered. Jewish historians have documented the fact that Hebrew biblical and post-biblical sources about the ancient Hebrews influenced John Adams's writings about American legal and constitutional thought. This was especially so in his important book, Defense of the Constitution of the United States of America, of the government of the United States of America. Also, the extensive correspondence between John Adams and his wife Abigail in the years just preceding and during the American Revolution is replete with allusions to the Hebrew Psalms and to other books of Jewish scripture during this critical period of American history. In other words, John and Abigail Adams traded biblical quotes back and forth, showing their deep familiarity with the biblical text. Adams also received important exposure to Hebrew scripture in church. I spoke earlier of how Hebrew biblical language and imagery worked its way into America's clergymen's sermons in the services which the founders attended almost every Sunday. Adams' interest in Jews and the Hebrew Bible also stemmed in part from his association with one such clergyman, the Reverend George Duffield. Duffield was a prominent Presbyterian minister and an ardent supporter of the American Revolution, who served as one of the two chaplains to the Continental Congress. During the sessions of 1776 in Philadelphia, John Adams and other delegates listened regularly to the Reverend Duffield's sermons, impressed by his very patriotic preaching. The Reverend Duffield made ample use of Jewish scriptures. He also alluded to the experience of the Jews in his discourses before the signing of the Declaration of Independence and with the advent of peace in 1783. Adams Adams was especially impressed with the way Duffield often compared the plight of the American people to the tribulations of the ancient Israelites, and said so in several letters to his wife Abigail. Once he wrote her about such a sermon in May 1776. It was less than 2 months before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, at a time when the debates in the Continental Congress had reached a tension point and the future course had not been determined. After listening to Duffield's preaching on the signs of the times, Adams wrote to his wife from Philadelphia, "I have this morning heard Mr. Duffield about the signs of the times. He ran a parallel between the case of Israel and that of America, and between the conduct of Pharaoh and that of King George. He concluded that the course of events strongly indicated the design of providence that we in America should be separated from Great Britain." With the coming of peace in 1783, Duffield preached to an oft-quoted sermon of Thanksgiving, much admired by Adams, in which the American colonies, our American Zion, as Adams called them, are referred to as the tribes of Israel, and George Washington as the Joshua of his day. He expressed his view that the hand of God as guiding and guarding the way of the Americans in their successful War of Independence. The Philo-Semitic thoughts and views of Reverend Duffield thus influenced Adams' favorable opinion about the Jews. John Adams's appreciation for Judaism and the contribution of the Jews to the making of a better world is most evident in the letters he wrote to his old friend, the Dutch jurist Francis van der Kemp. Adams had first met him while serving as the U.S. diplomat in Amsterdam during the early 1780s. Van der Kemp left Holland and settled in upstate New York, and he was one of the few close friends with whom Adams carried on an extensive correspondence in the 25 years before his death. Adams had been influenced by the Enlightenment and was well read in the works of Lord Bolingbroke and Voltaire, even as he rejected the most extreme, quote, enlightened views about Jews. Voltaire despised any religion, all religions, and especially the Jewish one. In Jewish circles, Voltaire is still viewed as being an outright anti-Semite, based on the things he had to say about Jews and Judaism. Adams was surprised and shocked by this. In a letter dated December 31st, 1808, the then retired second president of the United States wrote Van der Kemp that he was appalled by Voltaire's derogatory attitude toward the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish people. How is it possible that this old fellow, Voltaire, should represent the Jews in such contemptible light? Asked Adams. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited the earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bauble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And again, in a letter to Van der Kemp dated February 16th, 1809, Adams wrote, "In spite of Voltaire, I will insist that Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation." If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that the flight had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing nations. If I were an atheist of the other sect, who believe or pretend to believe that all order is ordained by chance, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and concerning and consequently of all civilization. Moreover, Adams alone among the founders believed in the restoration of the Jews to their own land in what he called Judea, a common name in use at that time. His expressions of this belief came through contact with a Jewish proto-Zionist of the time, Mordechai Noah, who is a very well-known figure amongst American Jewish historians. Noah once delivered a speech at a synagogue dedication where he focused on the universal history of Jewish persecution at the hands of non-democratic governments in their nations, and declared that the Jewish people could only live free of oppression when they were reestablished in their own home and could govern themselves. In other words, there was a supreme need for Jews to have a land of their own. Noah sent a copy of the speech to Adams. This initiated a correspondence between Noah and the former president. Adams in turn replied encouragingly, expressing his personal wish that your Jewish people may be admitted to all the privileges of citizens in every country of the world. The country has done much, our country. I wish it may do more and annul every narrow idea of religion, government, and commerce. It has pleased the providence of the first cause, the universal cause, that Abraham should give religion not only to the Hebrews, but to the Christians and Mohammedans, the greatest part of the modern civilized world. The following year, Adams, the only Christian Zionist amongst the founders, made the first public statement favoring Jewish resettlement in Judea by any American president. In 1819, Noah sent Adams a copy of his recently published book, Travels in England, France, Spain, and the Barbary States. In his letter of thanks acknowledging the gift, Adams praised the book, but regretted that it did not include a travelogue of Syria, Judea, and Jerusalem. Had Noah done so, Adams wrote, he would have attended more to his remarks than to those of any traveler I have ever read, adding, further, I could find it in my heart to wish you stood at the head of 100,000 Israelites, marching with them into Judea and making a conquest of that country, restoring your nation to the dominion of it. For I really wish the Jews again in Judea as an independent nation. Adams also urged that Hebrew studies be part of the classical curriculum, as his alma mater, Harvard College, and other American universities were. It should be noted, however, that Adams's exposure to the Jews of his own day was very limited, as was his case with most of the founding fathers, with the exception of Washington and Hamilton. As far as we know, Adams knew no Jews personally, had no Jewish clients in his Boston law practice, and had no Jewish neighbors or close friends. Most of the founders were probably better acquainted with the Jews of 3,000 years ago than they were with the Jews of their own day. Conclusion. Because of this relative lack of contact with living, breathing Jewish people, while a great deal has been written about the history of the Jewish political experience generally, we find that much less has been written about the relationship between the founding fathers and living American Jews. Both as individuals and as a community, Jews played a relatively insignificant role, when they played any role at all, in the standard biographies of John Adams, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and many of the other founders. Indeed, in some of the most acclaimed biographers of the founding fathers, Jews and the Jewish heritage are not mentioned at all. Ron Chernow's recent prize-winning biographies of Hamilton and Washington, in which Jews play a role, are the welcome exception. It is to be hoped that his example will be followed by others. However, despite the small numbers and infrequent appearances in the origin years of the United States, it would be wrong to say that Jews and the Jewish heritage did not have an enormous impact on the thinking and worldview of the founders who established the foundation upon which a new, free United States could be built. By their work, writing, fighting, and advocating for religious liberty and equality, they created the basis for what would ultimately become one of the largest Jewish communities on earth. They also, through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, created a haven for dissenters and persecuted minorities throughout the world. Thank you. I think I'd rather sit. Okay. Yeah, oh, this will be good. No. Oh, gosh. Oh, good. Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Dalin. The floor is open for questions. John's got a microphone over there, and Christy's got a microphone over here. Who would like to ask over right over here? Yes, please. John will give you the microphone.
Excuse me. Can you point me in a direction of how to find what Hebrew language was being spoken in these speeches and conversation? Because modern conversational Hebrew didn't exist until...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you know what form of Hebrew was being taught in those days? Presumably it's not, couldn't be modern conversational Hebrew. So how would you describe the Hebrew that, for example, Madison learned from Princeton?
Right, yeah. And Madison is the only one I know who gave an actual valedictory address in Hebrew, and then studied with, what's his name?
Well, with Wilson.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I don't know the answer to that, actually. I don't know if anyone else would know that particular.
Anyone who happens to have any knowledge of that? Yeah. Yes, is that a hand up? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, well, for many, many years spent in Hebrew Upanim, it was a sort of biblical Hebrew, a biblical conversational Hebrew, and they used to give bar mitzvah speeches in it before Eliezer ben Yehuda revived the modern Hebrew language, which is today spoken in Israel.
Yeah.
The model of modern Hebrew is actually the Mishnah, not the Bible. The Bible is a very clumsy language to speak, have a conversation in, and it's much more for poetry and prayer. So they spoke sort of biblical, conversational, bombastic Hebrew.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful. Very contribution. Thank you. Yes. Other questions? Yes, over here. I'll give you my microphone. There you go.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Can you help explain some of the rationale behind these two sort of odd trends? So one is where the Hebrew Bible itself is very revered, but then there were laws disadvantaging Jews. So that's kind of one weirdness going in one direction. But also in the other direction, that even though it seemed like the laws disadvantaging Jews was so prevalent, the Constitution was very expansive and progressive. And so why wouldn't they have simply followed kind of what the states had already kind of put in motion?
Well, that's a good question. And the Sephardic Hebrew, which the Sephardic was the Hebrew spoken by the Jews on the island of Nevis, and and they were very much. I'm trying to think. I had a note on that there. I'm sorry, but let me just. Could you get that just for me? I'm going to get one thing here. Oh, thank you so much. Honey, thank you, Robbie. Okay. No, I think that there was a differentiation by those who spoke Sephardic Hebrew and those who spoke what we call Ashkenazic Hebrew, which is spoken by most Jews in the United States today. And so that could be an interesting thing to delve into more.
Well, I think the specific question, if I understood it correctly, David, is so many of the states had restrictive laws.
Oh, yes.
Jews and Catholics and others were under, unless you belonged to the mainstream Protestant religion, you were under some restriction. And yet the Constitution of the United States is actually very broad in its protections. And you mentioned not only, of course, the First Amendment protection, express protection of religious liberty, but the very important, people today don't understand how critically important this was, the no religious tests clause.
Well, that's what I thought I mentioned, yeah.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, but the no religious test scores that, I think that test score, I'm going to find, I had a note about that, but a lot of, I'm just trying to think the example I had before. Well, but at the time of oh gosh, I may actually respond to my wife there. Does she remember that?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, we worked on this presentation a little bit together, so I guess I could answer that question. And that's the miraculousness of the American Constitution.
Yeah.
That's the wonder of it, is that you had so many of the founders who believed in religious liberty to the point that George Washington said that was what motivated him to go on the field of battle and shed his blood. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, which we didn't have time to go into very much, even though he had very derogatory things to say about the Jews of his own day. And he was very close to the views of Voltaire,
who, as you said, was an anti-Semite, could be considered an anti-Semite, what he had to say.
Yeah.
Nevertheless believed in religious liberty with all their hearts and built it into the very fabric, into the very skeleton, into the very bones of the United States.
Yeah.
That's what made the United States so special and why so many Jews settled here.
Yeah, well, by the way, at one point, there was a story after the Revolution that the United States might consider having Hebrew as the official American language, and it never happened.
Yes, a question over here, John. Can you give this gentleman the microphone?
After Babylonia, the spoken language was Aramaic.
Aramaic.
The Mishnah was written, the Talmud was written in Aramaic. So if he spoke in Hebrew, it must be the biblical Hebrew, not the spoken language.
Very good. Yeah,
Very good.
yeah. Other questions? Oh, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was interested in your discussion of the reading of the Hebrew Bible. I was wondering if they had any exposure to the Jewish interpretive traditions of the Tanakh, like, like the Talmud, anything like this. Yeah, I was just curious if they had any exposure beyond the sort of text itself.
To what?
To any of the great Jewish writings.
Post-biblical. Post-biblical, yeah. They did later on, but not in the early period, but they would later on, of course, have a good exposure to other, and also by the time of the I'm trying to think what year, but your answer is yes. The answer is yes, they did.
Other questions? Oh, Judge Carshby. Yes, Judge Carshby, please. Good to have you here, Judge.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I just have a question about the appeal of Madison and Adams and others to Hebrew studies. Was it anything more than studying more classics as they would study Greek, or was there a real connection in some ways to Judaism as a religion as opposed to a classical study?
Well, I wanted to find a reference to, no, it wasn't just a part of the regular classic studies, but it was, wait 1 second, if I could just declare this out. Oh, gosh. No, I don't think it was, okay. Well, James Madison he graduated Princeton rather early, I think, 1771. And he he gave his valedictory address in Hebrew. He's the only person who I found did that. And he also, I mentioned John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams, but there were other Jews, Jeff Madison is certainly one of them, who believed that a classical education must and should include Hebrew. And there were several people who felt that in Adams's time, John Adams and his cousin, and there were a lot And the very fact, I've been looking and looking for the, the footnote or the reference to the fact that for a time, it was considered many founding fathers considered having Hebrew as the national language of the United States.
No, David, I think I can help with Judge Karshman's question a little bit, go back to the question of whether it was just considered part of cultural studies or part of the classical education, or whether it had some real tie to the Jewish faith. And I think the answer to the question has to be the latter. As David pointed out, Rabbi Dalin pointed out, Madison not only studied with Witherspoon, he stayed to study Hebrew with Witherspoon. Witherspoon was a clergyman. He was the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. And although he was not president of the Constitutional Convention and is not signing the Constitution, he was a great supporter of the Constitution, was critical in New Jersey's ratification of the Constitution, which in turn was critical for the actual ratification of the Constitution as the Constitution of the country. Witherspoon, it's very clear, thought that Hebrew was important for religious purposes, that you had to understand the Hebrew Bible. You had to understand the Jewish religion as the mother religion of Christianity. You had to understand the Hebrew Bible if you were to be religiously informed. So it wasn't the way you might study Latin or Greek, as kind of antique religions, and a classically educated person would know Latin or Greek. Hebrew had a special and different status for somebody like Witherspoon. Now, the question of the degree of Madison's, David, I think you'll agree with this, the question of the degree of Madison's religiosity is disputed. How devout exactly he was. Jefferson was probably the least devout, not an atheist, but the least devout, even less devout than Franklin. And Madison certainly wasn't among the most devout, but he was most likely somewhere in between the two. But he's a student of Witherspoon's, and Witherspoon is not only devout, but is a Christian minister, and definitely sees Hebrew as important for the religious education of an educated person.
And Madison spent an extra year.
That's right. Yeah, so Madison, for that reason, Madison was Princeton's first graduate student.
Yes.
So he stayed after he got his baccalaureate, his undergraduate degree, for a year to study with Witherspoon to advance his understanding of Hebrew. Well, David, I want to thank you for coming.